This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students in the Academy's Classical Logic course with a guided reading through Lesson 2. In Lesson 1 we learned one simple lesson. The simple lesson was that no matter what field we're studying, no matter what subject we're talking about, there is a process of reasoning that's in us by nature that is always the same. And that's why the study of the art and science of logic is so important for us. It's a study that, unlike many other studies, can help us in every area of our life, in every subject we study, in every subject we discuss with others, and so on. So we learned in that first lesson the importance of the reality that there is one process of reasoning that applies in every different area of life and thought. And that's what makes this study so valuable for us. In this second lesson, you can see here in the margin, we read the origin of logic. So we're going to continue our introduction to the study of logic here in Lesson 2. Let's read through the text together, and I'll make a few comments as we go and try to help you prepare to complete your lesson assignment. Learn this lesson as efficiently as possible and move on in your study of classical logic. So let's read this together. Lesson 2 of classical logic. Supposing it then to have been perceived that the operation of reasoning is in all cases the same. So let's assume we all agree on this reality that we discussed in Lesson 1, that the operation of reasoning is in all cases the same. Supposing that to be true, the analysis of that operation could not fail to strike the mind as an interesting matter of inquiry. If that's true, then logic must be a most interesting subject of study. And moreover, since apparent arguments, and notice he has apparent here in parentheses, and in logic, in reasoning, anytime you see someone like Aristotle or a wise writer like the author of this textbook use the word apparent, it means false. It means that it appears to be reasonable, but it's actually not reasonable. When we move on in the study of logic, we're going to get to logical fallacies. And why the study of logical fallacies is important is because they appear to be valid arguments. They appear to be true. That's what makes them so dangerous. So just as a keyword, when you see that word apparent in reasoning, it's a bad thing. It means appears to be reasonable, but actually is not. So moreover, since apparent arguments, which are unsound and inconclusive, these are two important words, unsound and inconclusive. Whenever you see the word sound or unsound in reasoning, it refers to the truth of the statements. And whenever you see inconclusive or invalid, it means that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And we're going to get into all of this in this study. But these two words are the two different judgments that can be made of an argument. An argument can be sound or unsound, and an argument can be conclusive or inconclusive. And in other logic textbooks, you'll see the term valid and invalid. I think conclusive and inconclusive is a better term, or better terms to use than valid and invalid. So we've got sound and conclusive, which are good, and we've got unsound and inconclusive, which are bad. So these are important terms, and as we get into the rules of logic, you'll understand exactly what they mean. I just want you to be aware that the words we're reading here in these lessons, a lot of them are important words in the study of logic, and if you're taking notes, you should jot them down and keep an eye on those words in future lessons, all right? So let's go back to the beginning of that sentence. Moreover, since apparent arguments which are unsound and inconclusive are so often employed, so often used by people around us, hopefully not by us, but by people around us, either from error, meaning they simply make a mistake, or design, they're intending to try to deceive us. That's one or two reasons really why this study should be especially important to us, because apparent arguments are so often employed. Arguments that appear on the surface to be true and reasonable, but really aren't. And that can be from a simple error or from design, from an intended deception. Since even those who are not misled by these fallacies are so often at a loss to detect and expose them in a manner satisfactory to others or even to themselves. So it's one thing to catch a fallacy, but it's another thing to be able to explain what's wrong about the argument so that others become convinced and see that it's an unsound or an inconclusive argument. So apparent arguments, or arguments that appear to be true but are not, they're fallacies, which are unsound and or inconclusive, are so commonly used that we have to be constantly paying attention and discerning these things, and also because when we do find an error in someone's argument or in the statements that someone makes, we have to communicate and explain and show that error in a clear and convincing way. It could not but appear desirable to lay down some general rules of reasoning that are applicable to all cases, by which a person might be enabled the more readily, that means quickly and easily, conveniently, by which a person might be enabled the more readily and clearly to state the grounds of his own conviction or of his objection to the arguments of an opponent, instead of arguing at random, which is what most people, and which is what we will do if we don't study the science and art of logic. Instead of arguing at random without any fixed and acknowledged principles to guide his procedure. We want to be able to do this in an orderly and efficient way. Such rules would be analogous or comparable to those of arithmetic, which obviate the tediousness and uncertainty of calculations in the head. It's one thing to face an arithmetic question, like, if you ask a young child to solve a problem, they may be able to solve it. They may be able to figure out a solution, but an experienced student of arithmetic will know exactly what to do, will know exactly how to approach a problem, will know the methods and the solutions, the steps, or even the rules that can be followed, and can efficiently, quickly, and clearly solve the problem. That's the difference. Such rules in logic would be comparable to those of arithmetic, which obviate or take away the tediousness, that's the difficulty, and uncertainty of calculations in the head, wherein, after much labor, different persons might arrive at different results, without any of them being able distinctly to point out the error of the rest. You can see that confusion that would exist when people are trying to figure something out and none of them know the rules or principles clearly to be able to not only solve the problem but also explain what others get wrong. A system of such rules, it is obvious, must, instead of being called the art of wrangling, wrangling means like arguing to no purpose, just arguing in vain. Rather than being called the art of wrangling, be more justly characterized as the art of cutting short wrangling. By bringing the parties to issue, parties means both sides, to issue at once, if not to agreement, and thus saving a waste of ingenuity. In pursuing the supposed investigation, it will be found that every conclusion is deduced. Deduced means drawn from. Every conclusion is deduced or drawn from, in reality, two other propositions. These are called premises. So we have two important terms here, conclusion and premises. Every conclusion is deduced or drawn from two other propositions called premises. Now, just to make sure you're familiar with these terms, a proposition is a sentence. I'm sorry, I can't highlight these clearly, but a proposition is something that is put forth. It's a statement that is put forth. And what makes a statement a proposition is that it's a statement that is true or false. So a question cannot be a proposition. A prayer or a request for something like, please give me my shirt, cannot be a proposition. A command, get up, cannot be a proposition. A proposition is a statement that can be true or false, like today is Saturday. That's a proposition. Or the man is Greek. That's a proposition. A proposition is a statement that is true or false. So a conclusion is drawn from two propositions, and these two propositions are called premises. So in an argument, we have three propositions. We have two premises and one conclusion that's drawn from those two premises. Now, you may not understand this yet, and that's fine, because we're going to study this in very great detail in this course. But I just want you to be familiar with these terms, so when you read this chapter, you can have a good sense about what the author is trying to explain. So let's read that again. In pursuing this investigation of this system of rules that will help us, it will be found that every conclusion is deduced from two other propositions, which are called premises. For though one of these may be and commonly is suppressed, that means not mentioned. We're going to learn that often, though there are two premises behind every conclusion, sometimes only one of the premises is stated and the other is simply understood. That's what he means by suppressed. Though one of these two premises may be suppressed, it must nevertheless be understood as being admitted, as may easily be made evident by supposing the denial of the suppressed premise, which will at once invalidate the argument. For example, now let me just give you one little bit of advice. Anytime you're studying reasoning or philosophy, if you have a good source, a good textbook, or you're studying Aristotle, for example, you're going to see that sometimes the rules that they give, the explanations they give are difficult to understand because you're unfamiliar with what they're talking about. You've never seen it before. You're just getting started with these studies and they introduce a new idea. You'll find that good teachers, especially Aristotle, always give examples. And this abbreviation, e.g., introduces an example. It means that an example is being given. So here's the principle he explains. It must be understood that the premise that's suppressed is admitted, as may be made evident by supposing that the denial of the suppressed premise, which will at once invalidate the argument. So what does that mean, all this gibber about denying the suppressed premise and blah, what's that mean? You'll often find yourself confused as you read, but just keep reading, because a good teacher knows that this is difficult for students to understand, and he's going to continue to explain it and give you examples. You can always go back and reread it, but first keep reading and see if the teacher continues to explain and clear things up. So here's an example he gives us. If anyone, from perceiving that the world exhibits marks of design. So let's just take this proposition. This proposition, the world exhibits marks of design. That means when you look around in the world, there are signs that someone designed this world. The world exhibits marks of design. It doesn't look like it was formed by chance. It doesn't look random. There's order, and it appears that there is design in the world. Some say intelligent design. So that's the first premise. The world exhibits marks of design. And then concludes, it must have had an intelligent author. So notice here we've got just two statements, two propositions. We've got a premise, the world exhibits marks of design. And we've got a conclusion, it must have had an intelligent author. The world must have an intelligent author. This word infers means to draw a conclusion. To infer means that a conclusion can be drawn from something that's been said. So if we take one premise, the world exhibits marks of design, and we draw from it a conclusion, the world must have an intelligent author. There is a second premise that's suppressed. It hasn't been stated, but in our minds, we know it. We're conscious of it. We're aware of it, and we see and understand how that person moved from the first premise, the world exhibits marks of design, to that conclusion. It must have an intelligent author. There's another proposition that connects the premise and the conclusion. It's understood. And if you think about it, even for just a little bit, you'll be able to discern what that other premise is. But the author here explains, though he may not be aware in his own mind of the existence of any other premise, he will readily understand it if it be denied that whatever exhibits marks of design must have had an intelligent author. That's the missing premise. Whatever exhibits marks of design must have an intelligent author. That's actually the first premise, which is assumed. Whatever exhibits marks of design must have an intelligent author. Then we see the second premise, which we read before. The world exhibits marks of design. And from those two premises, we reason to the conclusion. The world must have an intelligent author. So when we spoke that first premise, the world exhibits marks of design, there was already another premise in our mind, which was whatever exhibits marks of design must have an intelligent author. The world does exhibit marks of design, therefore the process of reasoning kicks in and draws the conclusion. The world must have had an intelligent author. That's the process of reasoning. From those two premises, we come to a third proposition, the conclusion. Those three statements form an argument, and that is the process of reasoning. But what the author is showing is sometimes what the first premise is simply not spoken, it's understood. But there are always three propositions in an argument. And again, we're going to get into all of this in very great detail in this course. So be familiar, follow along. You can replay this video or back up and listen to something again if you want to hear it again. But we're going to study all of this in detail. The author is just introducing these simple ideas about the process of reasoning to introduce you to the subject. All right, so what we learn here in this paragraph is that every conclusion is deduced from two premises. So if you're taking notes, that's the line you want. Every conclusion is deduced from two premises. Sometimes the two premises won't be spoken, but they're both understood. That's the process of reasoning. Moving from the premises to a necessary conclusion that flows from those two premises. Let's keep reading here. Again, you can go back and reread that, listen to this talk again, so I'm going to move on here. Or again, he says, if anyone on meeting with, quote, an animal which has horns on the head, infers that it is a ruminant, he will easily perceive that this would be no argument to anyone who should not be aware of the general fact that all horned animals ruminate. Ruminate means that an animal has multiple stomachs and they eat grass. Like a cow is a ruminant, a ruminating animal. The cow will eat large quantities of grass, swallow it down, partially digest it, bring it back up into its mouth, chew it more, and then continue to swallow it, and it will actually move through a number of different stomachs. That's called ruminating. And we have a general proposition here that all horned animals ruminate. So if someone says an animal that has horns on its head is a ruminant, the proposition that all horned animals ruminate is understood. That's the process of reasoning, and we're going to study it in detail. So let's keep going here. What we learned, remember, we learned that every conclusion is drawn from two propositions called premises. So an argument is made up of three propositions, two premises and a conclusion that necessarily follows from those two premises. In the next paragraph, in the margin here, you can see this word syllogism. Syllogism. A syllogism is the name for that argument that we've just discussed in the previous paragraph. An argument thus stated regularly and at full length, that is with all three propositions. An argument stated regularly in a regular manner and at full length with all three propositions is called a syllogism, which therefore is evidently not a peculiar kind of an argument. A syllogism is not a kind of argument as if there are others, but a syllogism is the peculiar form of expression in which every argument may be stated. Every argument may be stated in the form of a syllogism. A syllogism is not simply a kind of argument. The syllogism is the form in which every argument, every sound and conclusive argument may be expressed. So the syllogism is the form of an argument. Three propositions, two premises, and a conclusion that necessarily follows from those two premises. That's a syllogism. Let's move on here. When one of the premises is suppressed, when one of the premises is not spoken, so there's only two propositions, we only see or hear two propositions, a premise and a conclusion. that two-proposition argument is called an enthymeme. Enthymeme. So we've got two important terms here. A syllogism, which is the full expression of the three propositions of an argument, and an enthymeme, which is just an abbreviated syllogism, because there's still a syllogism. It's just that one of the premises is not stated. When we state that premise and make it clear, we form a syllogism. So an enthymeme is an abbreviated syllogism. When one of the premises is suppressed, usually for the sake of brevity, that is just for making things easier and making conversations shorter, the argument is called an enthymeme. Let's keep moving. And it may be worthwhile to remark that when the argument is in this state, in the form of an enthymeme with just one premise and a conclusion, the objections of an opponent are, or, notice this danger word here, the objections of an opponent are, or rather appear to be, remember in reasoning, the word appear is a bad word. In this state of an enthymeme, the objections of an opponent are, or rather appear to be, of two kinds. You've got this abbreviation viz, that means namely. The objections are of two kinds, or they appear to be of two kinds, namely either objections to the assertion itself, whether it's true or false, that's sound or unsound, or objections to its force as an argument, an objection to whether it's conclusive or not, or valid. So when we're discussing something with someone, or even when we're just thinking ourselves, when we draw a conclusion, when someone draws a conclusion, we want to ask two questions of the propositions. We want to ask, first of all, if they're all true. That's the first question. Are the premises true? Because the premises need to be true. If the premises are false, there's no argument. The premises need to be true. And then the second question we need to ask is, does the conclusion actually follow from the premises? So there are two questions to ask when we consider an argument. Are the premises true? And is the conclusion necessarily drawn from the premises? So those two questions. Now you see what's happening is we're starting to learn a method. And you can begin to use this immediately. We're starting to learn a method. So rather than listening to people talk or reading something and just waiting until we luckily catch an error, now you can see we can begin to pay attention and think about exactly what we're trying to get to. We're trying to examine the things that they say, things that others say, or again, things that we say ourselves, and ask whether the propositions that we set up as the premises are true or not. And then if they are true, does our conclusion necessarily flow from them? So now we've got these two sets of questions to guide us in our discussions, in our readings, in our meditations, and so on. And you can see how in just a few paragraphs, we've already got the beginning of a strategy for how to listen to arguments and what to look for. That's the benefit of this study, and we're just getting started. But you can see how it's going to be helpful. So we're looking at objections to the assertion itself, whether it's true or false, or objections to its force as an argument. For example, e.g., in one of the above instances, an atheist may be conceived either denying that the world does exist by marks of design, or denying that it follows from that it had an intelligent author. So if there's an atheist arguing with us or discussing the subject with us, he may object to one of the premises and say, that's not true. What you said is the premise is not true. And we can discuss or look for evidence as to whether or not the premise is true. Or he can deny that the conclusion actually follows from the premises, because it can be an apparent syllogism and not a real syllogism. Let's keep moving here. Now, it is important to keep in mind that the only difference in the two cases, that in the one, the expressed premise is denied, and in the other, the suppressed. So there's two different terms here. Expressed means that both premises are spoken. Suppressed means that one is not spoken. If you want to think of other words to make this clearer, you could think of spoken and understood. A premise that's spoken and a premise that's not spoken but is understood. Because the force as an argument of either premise depends on the other premise. If both be admitted, the conclusion legitimately connected with them cannot be denied. And this is the power of reasoning. Reasoning leads us to understand that if we form a true, a good argument, a real syllogism, if the two premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That's what reasoning is. If the conclusion follows from the premises, and if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Next paragraph. It is evidently immaterial to the argument. It's irrelevant. It is immaterial to the argument whether the conclusion is placed first or last. The normal way of writing a syllogism is to start with the general principle first, then the specific principle, and then the conclusion. That's the normal way to write a syllogism. But it doesn't need to be written in that order. It doesn't matter whether the conclusion is put first or last, and we'll see the author, the teacher here, explain this for us. It may be proper to remark that a premise placed after the conclusion, so if the conclusion is put before the premise, it is called the reason of it. The premise is the reason for the conclusion. And it is introduced by one of those conjunctions which are called causal, a causal conjunction. A causal conjunction joins a cause to its effect. And we use these conjunctions since or because. These conjunctions, since and because, are causal conjunctions. They connect the cause to the effect. So if the conclusion is stated first, then, and the premise is stated second, we'll connect them by using the conjunctions since or because or for in order to properly present that argument. And this may be employed to designate a premise whether it comes first or last. And then the illative conjunction therefore is called an illative conjunction. That's used before the conclusion when the conclusion comes after the premises. This is true and this is true, therefore this must be true. So you can see when the conclusion is put last, therefore is placed before it to connect it to the premises. But if the conclusion is placed first, then since or because or for is placed before the premise to show that it's the reason of the conclusion which was stated first. All right, so that simply explains that a syllogism could be written in different ways, but as I said, normally the premises are stated first and the conclusion last. So normally in a syllogism, the conjunction is therefore. That's how syllogisms are normally written. Let's keep moving. It is a circumstance which often occasions error and perplexity or confusion that both these classes of conjunctions, both classes, causal conjunctions and illative conjunctions, you should jot those terms down and make sure you know what they mean and include the examples in your notes. It is a circumstance which often occasions error and perplexity that both these classes of conjunctions have also other significations. They have other meanings, being employed to denote respectively cause and effect, as well as premise and conclusion. And again, remember, anytime you're reading and you find something a little confusing, just keep reading. Keep reading, because if you have a good teacher, and the author of this textbook is a good teacher, he's not going to say something and forget that the students might not understand it. He's going to explain. Just read, reread, and keep reading. And after you've read some more, go back and reread again. But you'll see that the authors of the textbooks that we use in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy are good teachers, and you'll see them explain. For example, if I say, this ground is rich because the trees on it are flourishing. This ground is rich because the trees on it are flourishing. Or if I say, the trees are flourishing, therefore the soil must be rich. I employ these conjunctions, and notice they're in italics, because and therefore. I employ these conjunctions to denote the connection of a premise and a conclusion. For it is plain that the luxuriance of the trees, the fruitfulness of the trees, is not the cause of the soil's fertility, but only my cause of knowing that the soil is fertile. If again I say, the trees flourish because the ground is rich, or the ground is rich and therefore the trees flourish, I'm using the very same conjunctions to denote the connection of cause and effect. For in this case, the luxuriance of the trees, being evident to the eye, would hardly need to be proved, but might need to be accounted for. There are, however, many cases in which the cause is employed to prove the existence of its effect, especially in arguments relating to future events, as, for example, when from favorable weather, good weather, anyone argues that the crops are likely to be abundant. The cause and the reason in that case coincide, and this contributes to their being so often confounded together in other cases. So that brings us to the end of Lesson 2, and the most important idea or lesson to be drawn from this lesson, I would argue, is this statement here. Every conclusion is deduced from two other propositions called premises. The form of that argument, the two premises and conclusion, is called a syllogism. And the expression of that argument when one of the premises is suppressed or not spoken is an enthymeme. So very simply, that's the main idea of this second lesson, just introducing us to the form of a good argument, so we can begin to think scientifically about arguments and realize that we hear arguments, hundreds and hundreds of arguments every single day. And if we're conscious of the form of arguments and how arguments actually work in reasoning, we'll start paying attention and we'll start to recognize arguments. We'll start to recognize syllogisms and enthymemes in the things that people say, in the things that we read, and so on. So that's the main idea of this second lesson. Every conclusion is deduced from two other propositions called premises. That form of an argument is called a syllogism, and the expression of that argument when one of the premises is suppressed is called an enthymeme. All right? And as I said, that brings us to the end of Chapter 2 here. Remember, This is only introduction. This is only introduction. We're going to study all of this stuff in great detail. So just pay attention to the main idea of these chapters. Reread this chapter for yourself carefully. Reread it in light of the things that I've explained, and make sure you understand every sentence in the reading. If there's anything you read that you don't understand after listening to this talk, after reading it and rereading it and thinking about it, post a question on the course support forum and make it known, because I'm sure that if there's a sentence that you struggle to understand, there are going to be other students that struggle with that same sentence. So do yourself a favor, do the other students a favor, and post your questions on the course forum. I'll keep an eye out for them, and when I see questions come through, I'll be sure to answer them. And if you do post a question and I don't respond within a day or two, just shoot me a note and let me know. Send me a link to your post, and I'll get right to it and give you as good an answer as I can, whether I just answer from my own words or whether I share some sources with you to help you understand what you're struggling with. All right, I hope that guided reading for Lesson 2 is helpful. Study the lesson for yourself now. Review this video if you need to, and then complete your lesson assignment, and we'll move on together in our study of classical logic. God bless your studies.